All right. Hello, everyone. Let's go ahead and call this meeting of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to order at 6 p.m. I'm going to note for our new minute taker, Nicole, thank you very much for your service, that all members are present except member Doreen Wilbur is absent. And we have Tawanda Stallworth attending by Zoom and Counselor Stubbe attending by Zoom. Next order of business is the approval of minutes. We are going to table that until the next meeting of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The incorrect set of minutes were distributed prior to the meeting, not the minutes of the 7/19 meeting, and we will have a second set of minutes to review at our next meeting because we will review the minutes of the joint session we attended late last week. So we'll have two sets of minutes at our next meeting. So no motion needed. We can go right on to our discussion items. So the first discussion item is our Unity Day debrief. And I just wanted to give the commission some time to reflect on that event that we attended together. Any observations? So I'm going to go ahead and open the floor. Does anyone have anything they'd like to share about how Unity Day went?
I thought the event was a really wonderful idea. I think because it was the first one, it wasn't perhaps executed in a way to most efficiently achieve its goal. I thought it was more of a religious event than we were initially thinking it would be. And I think that having a religious event of this kind might not be the best way to bring about unity because they're secular members of our community. But I think, again, the idea was a good one. And I just wish we had more opportunities to distribute materials and collect information from people specifically about the TRC.
Raz?
Yeah, it was a challenge, and even I gotta give credit being the first ever Unity Day event as well. But it was challenging just interacting, engaging with the public. I think part of that was event structure, if you will. There were a lot of presentations, a lot of really good and engaging presentations, but it didn't leave a ton of room for engagement. So we maybe didn't get the crowdsourcing that we would have liked. I think a majority of our ideas came from some kids who. Okay, yeah, sorry, I don't want to jump ahead or anything. But overall, I found it beneficial, even just from a personal standpoint of getting to meet other community leaders. But as far as our work is concerned, maybe not quite as beneficial.
Anyone else?
Hi, Emily. I'll chime in. I think if my memory serves me correctly, I sort of brought this event to the commission. And I think in retrospect, it may have been helpful if I would have gathered a little bit more information about program and purpose and agenda for the event. So I think that's a learning moment for me in how we participate, just getting all of the information that we can, because I would agree with the sentiments that were shared earlier, both by Raf and by Raz, that I just agree with them. So that's something that I can do moving forward. Thanks.
Thank you. So Raz and I did collect some feedbacks from some very young residents, and they did end up putting a card in our feedback box requesting more candy stores and free pocket puppies as ways to promote unity and to heal divides. But not bad ideas, all things considered. But we did get one proposal in our idea box. So we had this we had a stack of index cards in this box available for people to give feedback. And I think if nobody has anything specific to Unity Day to share, maybe we should transition to item B, which is community events and speaking engagements looking forward. Because the index card I'm going to share in a moment will raise a question about protocols and structure for doing community events and speaking engagements moving forward. So what a resident shared was a request to do a community event on the following situation. She has a "In This House We Believe" yard sign. Her next door neighbor has a "Support Police" yard sign. They had a civil but tense conversation about yard sign placement, like you need to keep your yard sign really clearly in your yard. And there was kind of a question raised about, is there something that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission could do to facilitate maybe a town hall about talking about yard sign communication? And not so much to mediate this conflict of what are you allowed to put in your yard, because of course you're allowed to put whatever, but there's a desire to have conversations with people about their yard signs. But how do you do that? How do you approach your next door neighbor and say, we have different opinions, obviously, based on our yard signs, but I really want to talk to you about it. So that was kind of the one index card that contained an idea that was like, that could possibly be a community event that we could host. But there's also this more general question of, how do we collect feedback like that, and what does our deliberative process look like for deciding when we're going to elevate a piece of feedback like that to a community event that we might hold? So let me open the floor on that question. What does our decision-making process look like for deciding how frequently to have community events, what type of community events we have, how we handle feedback from the public about the nature of those events?
Emily, just for clarification, is this question blown out to requests for the TRC to be represented in a certain place? So earlier this year we did the League of Women Voters, I believe it was.
No, I'm calling that speaking engagements, and I think there's a different protocol there. This is more a community member says, hey, you guys say that you're interested in facilitating dialogue and hosting conversations. I'd like to have one about how do we talk to one another about our yard signs? And that's different than being invited by the Rotary Club to explain what it is that we do.
Perfect, thank you.
I think I might have been answering the wrong question here, but my thought, I like this as a vehicle to at least discuss that, and even, well, if I can go to the other side of that question, which is like even the participation in something like Unity Day, I think this was the perfect forum. I think it was definitely worthwhile just being there. So even just having a presence, we might not have gotten the most return on investment, if you will, but I like that as a means of drawing that out. As to the question of like what would we facilitate, I mean, outside of this gathering, this organization, I'm not sure, other than email correspondence, but do we put that to a vote? Is that something?
Yeah, I think something like a vote might be a good idea. I also thought if it was going to be a vote, would we require it to be a majority or a smaller number who are just interested? One thought I had is that on the one hand, I always feel like I'm worried about mission creep and us trying to do too many things and accordingly not doing other things very well. But if there are people who are interested in doing certain events, and it's not going to take away too much of their bandwidth from doing the other things to which they're assigned, then I think maybe not even a majority is necessary. Like if there are 3 people who really want to do something and want to facilitate a conversation about something, it feels like we probably shouldn't prevent them from doing so, or at least on its face, it doesn't seem like we ought to.
Tristan.
Yeah, so I think when I'm like doing presentations or something like that, it wouldn't even be necessarily us leading these conversations. It would be somebody potentially who is a quote unquote expert in this. So we may be a part of the host organization doing it, and maybe partnering with other organizations, so borough government, CCHS, any other maybe church groups, to find a space to bring everybody together from different outlets. That might be a way to do it. So and I might have brought this up at one point before, I've always been interested in doing something like a community conversation series through the Historical Society, which in my vision was basically bringing people together and saying, okay, today's topic is restaurants in Carlisle. What do you remember about restaurants? Bring pictures if you have any, bring your stories, things like that. But we can turn it into more of a workshops community conversation series. So say today's conversation is going to be about opposing beliefs in your neighborhood. Can you come and bring a story of that? Maybe we have a speaker or a roundtable discussion, so people who are quote unquote experts to that can speak. So it wouldn't necessarily even be on us only to do this. It might be also finding those partners in the community, finding those connections to do it. But we'll say, hosted by Carlisle Borough, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, maybe the Human Rights Commission, a couple different people to bring it together. So it wouldn't necessarily be all on us to do these things. It would just be, hey, let's do this with a bunch of other people, and that's multiple outlets we can find too. So just an idea.
Okay, let's crystallize the possibilities on the table right now, see if we need to add to that range of possibilities, and then narrow down and make a decision about what we want to do. One option is we're not in the business of hosting community events. It's fine for us to attend, it's fine for us to help out, but that's not really what we're doing. Another option is we could have a regular schedule, like say once a quarter we host a town hall on something that is our job. Another option is, I think I heard this coming from you, Raph, that community events might organically arise out of our own work groups. As people start to work on issues, they might realize there's a really important conversation for us to have. And then when our own members propose that particular conversation, we take a vote about whether to have that event. And then I think those are the 3 options I heard. No engagement, have a regular calendar, see if it organically arises. Does that sound right? Okay. How do we feel about those 3 options? Yeah, go for it.
Well, one thought is that those aren't mutually exclusive, right? So it may be that we have some community events, but then there are organic things like somebody suggests, why don't we do a community thing about that? And so we'd have to think about whether we would allow that combination.
I think we may also even want to reference our action plan just to consider that we've already built a lot in, and we to your point, Raph, earlier, like we don't want to risk too much scope creep, given the nature of what we're already taking on. But having said that, I think we've already built wiggle room in our action plan that if something were to come up organically, it'd be pretty easy to join in an effort like that. So I guess I would lean more towards that alternative.
I agree with that. I do worry about mission creep, definitely, and I think that while I'm not necessarily opposed to those type of events, and I think that some of those events might be very helpful for us to learn some things, whether we're hosting or partnering with other entities. I think both could be viable ways to approach it. But I think this we want to be make sure it's narrowly tailored to speak to our cause, which is trying to find information related to racial inequity and systemic racism and those types of issues. So, when I think about political signage, what's the root of that? Is the root of that? And I think you said, was it Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter? Was that the two signs?
I don't remember specifically what they were, but they were of that nature.
Okay.
Yes, yes.
So, perhaps if we were to get involved in something like that, it's really focusing on what the root of those two issues, and the racial element associated with those two signs, and what that means, and how that might have been perpetuated over the history at Carlisle or in Carlisle.
Tawanda.
Uh, this is great conversation. I think I agree with a lot of what's been said. And I too took a look at the action plan just to kind of see like where something like this might fit in. And I mean, we have, open forum TRC meetings inviting community members to appear and share their experiences. And to me, that speaks to our already scheduled monthly meetings, but maybe it also is a set quarterly meeting where folks can come and just openly share on a particular theme that we set ahead of time. And if we want to rotate, like who the point might be for that meeting, or and that might include working with another nonprofit, or working with, like Tristan said, the experts on a particular subject matter. So I think I'm probably in the camp of having them regularly scheduled. And I think that does fit in with our scope. And I too like what Kendall said about keeping in mind with our mission, so that any data that we can glean from these quarterly meetings would be helpful and help us to advance our cause.
I think I'm hearing consensus that this body doesn't want to commit to hosting any kind of regular schedule of conversation. Just treat our regular meetings as things that the public can participate in and jump in on opportunities or create opportunities as they arise topically in the course of our regular work. That's a nice transition to the other part of this, which is speaking engagements. So I know, for instance, I was recently invited by the Rotary Club to give a presentation on what we're doing. And that's the reason this is a good transition, is because most of the suggestions I personally have been getting are about community events. And so it is good to be able to say, here's what we do, here's what we don't do. So I wanted to broach the conversation of some of us might, as individuals, be asked to give a presentation about the TRC and what it's doing. And sometimes when that happens on a group, there can be tension because there's not a collective awareness that that's happening or of what the messaging is. And so I wanted to make sure that we are all on the same page with respect to responding to invitations to speak about our collective work. And if there are any ground rules, norms, expectations that anyone wanted to share about what we do in those contexts. Kendall.
Yes. So that immediately struck a chord with me, primarily because I am a Rotarian, and that I find that quite interesting, and I wonder if that plays a little bit into why we exist. That I've been to both Rotaries, the breakfast one and the lunch one. I've been members of both at specific times, and so to not have been approached is really interesting. But I'm finished.
Tristan.
Yeah, I don't think this addresses norms or anything like that, but I will say, for transparency, during Unity Day, I was actually in Mechanicsburg representing the Society for an African American cemetery dedication. That's where I was that day. And I will say that I talked to about 9 reporters that week about this, and a lot of them were like, "Oh, tell me about Lincoln Cemetery. By the way, I heard you're the one on the Truth and Reconciliation. Can you give me some details about that?" So I've been answering those questions very generally because I think they're just interested to know what we're doing because they want to cover us. But just in my role at the society, people are like, oh, I know that name from somewhere else. So I have been getting it, but it hasn't been like, I'm going to interview now. But just to keep that in the forefront too, that I think these speaking engagements may also be reporters, because especially the Sentinel is interested in reporting. And if we have guidance, please let me know if it is speak to this person instead, or if I am allowed to answer, as long as it's not like an actual interview, but if they want to just have ideas of where we're going, how I should handle that too, because I don't want to overstep. I'm kind of playing two roles there, and I don't know how much is overstepping into one or how much is just pushing it off onto somebody else when I can't answer it. So I think that will be a larger discussion we'll probably have to have, because we all have very different roles just in the community, but those may come up in different, aspects in different ways.
That's a better way of stating exactly the question I'm kind of trying to get at. Is the press, I think, puts the point even more clearly that we do need to have a conversation about protocol. And you asked if there are some. I wish I knew. There aren't any. That's what we're deciding now.
Can I just jump in there real quick? I'm sorry, Raf. You may have unmuted before I just jumped in there. I kind of just need to really affirm Kendall in his experience in this moment, uh, and I'm really hoping that this becomes a part of our minutes, that part of this discussion is happening, and the ways in which this has unfolded. So, Kendall, I just really need to affirm you right now, and just I, I'm on your street, and then also, just to add, we do have an email address, right? So the TRC does have an email address. So if we're comfortable with a protocol that says, here's our email address, this is the best way to get in touch with the commission, so that the commission can, take your request under advisement. That might be, sounds a little bit cop-outish, but also sounds like it's the most equitable way for us to address those matters.
I may have missed what was going on there, and I apologize for that. The invitation to speak at Rotary came at Unity Day. A Rotarian came to the table and just discovered us and said, "Oh, this would be a nice group to have come talk at the Rotary." So it was not. I personally was not solicited for an invitation. It just happened organically at Unity Day.
I hear you, Emily, and I don't want to belabor this, but I do want to say that Kendall is the Rotarian. And if someone was at Unity Day and saw the TRC, they would have also known that Kendall is a Rotarian. And I think that that's, again, to Kendall's point, part of the reason why this commission exists is really getting to some of those covert ways and unspoken potential racist behaviors that happen in our community. And a lot of times, my great grandmother would always say, a lot of times it's not what your intent was. And I'm not saying you, I'm saying anyone. It's not what our intent is, but oftentimes it's the impact and what that can do to further beliefs or further relationships. And how do we, as a commission, work to undo some of that work? Is that making sense?
It does, but I think we do need to balance that against demands on our labor. So we can get into a structure that is almost so flat that it's hierarchical and it's not efficient, and we don't end up responding to requests to speak. So, for instance, a speaking engagement was when Doreen was participating in a class at Dickinson College. I'm more of the school of thought that I'm completely comfortable with her representing us, and I probably favor looser protocol in terms of how do we clear this with one another. So maybe we should kind of sketch out the range of positions here. One position could be a position of radical trust. You get invited to do something for some reason, or a reporter bumps into you at an event, and we trust one another to respond to those queries and invitations with little consultation. Another extreme is we make a decision that all such invitations and queries need to go through the whole committee. We can give people who ask us questions and offer us invitations the commission's email address and say, please email this email address with your question, and the commission will discuss it and will respond to you and let you know what the answer is or who will be speaking. So those are kind of two polls. What do we think?
I think for me at least, generally with like what I am used to, and especially in the nonprofit world, we have case statements that we always pull from the spirit of if we're speaking to anybody. And I think we already have that with our mission and action plan. So I think as long as we know we're all speaking in the spirit of what we're doing, we all are commission members, and I think that will be more efficient to say. If I get approached and somebody asks me to do it, or sometimes they'll say, who's the chair, co-chair, who can I speak to? But I think if we're on the hook like that, people aren't going to like if we say, oh, well, can you email us all the details to us and then we'll get to it at our next meeting? Because they're going to start just overlooking what we're doing, and especially press too, which is what had come up in the last few weeks for me, that if I'm not talking to them while they're on the phone and we say, here's our email us, they're not going to do it. And then they're not going to cover us. So I think it's also do we want to lose out on speaking engagements, or do we trust each other enough to speak in the spirit of what we're doing to do it when we're on the hook? And I am more so trusting each other to do it in the spirit of what we're doing, unless, like I said, somebody is like, can I speak to the chair, co-chair? I much prefer them represented, but again, we're all in different places in the community, and I'd hate to lose out on coverage just because we want a process in line. And if we had tabled Doreen's speaking engagement, she might have lost that altogether, or lost just to be able to pump us to a class. So I'm on more of the trust in each other, because I think we're all here for a specific reason and we can all trust in each other.
So I'm somewhere in the middle. I think I like process, although I think that there's two different things that's circulating in my mind. One is that if someone just approaches and wants a quick statement about something, to me that is a quick statement of trust. I think if they want more of a formalized interview, our bylaws actually speak to that. That goes to our co-chairs in the first instance. So that would be Emily or Tawanda. Now, there may be an instance that is not an immediate like interview with a media person or something like that, but someone actually wants you to come and do a presentation. I think maybe what Doreen did, for instance. To me, while we certainly could default to the co-chairs, I do think that there's an opportunity for us to communicate with each other, whether it's asking the people to use this email, or whether whether whoever they're speaking with, they say, well, I'm going to take it back to the commissioners, and we will see who is best suited to present at that particular event. Then we can talk about it and determine, based on people's time, experience, interest, who might be best suited. And so I think it could still be a little bit less formal than giving someone an email address, because in that moment, I think you're right, Tristan, we may lose them, but that doesn't mean that we can't operationally just communicate with each other behind the scenes and just tell them, okay, let me get back to you with who's going to be the most appropriate person, if we can do it.
Chris?
Yeah, I'm very much on the side of I trust all you guys. I've read your bios. I know that we have the same true north here, so I have no hesitation about anyone just speaking. I don't say off the cuff, but in any conditional circumstance. I think it would be cool for us to have some sort of standard for if it were a larger engagement that no matter what the repository, if it's the box that we bring to Unity Day, that we make sure we do bring that to light publicly. Especially, I'd want to know, like, if I'd submitted something in the Unity Day box, that it would be considered, even if it was a candy store. Just to have that voice. But I'm definitely on the side of if you're approached, please definitely speak on our behalf.
I think that I think my view is a little bit closer to Kendall's. And one, I think that we have chairs in part so that they serve as spokespersons for us. So that's one of the thoughts that I have. Another thought I had is that it might be a good idea to come and talk as a group about um, who might address something, so that all of our faces get out there. I think that that also is an important thing, so that it's not the case that, I don't know, someone is always talking to Kendall, that Tristan, Raz, and everyone else gets to um, get some exposure as well, and gets to highlight maybe some of the things that they will be doing, because we won't all be doing the very same things all the time. So yeah, I think that maybe a method, again, just echoing what Kendall said, is maybe for off the cuff stuff, we should indeed just answer if you're just right there. But if there's a request for something a little bit more structured, longer perhaps, maybe it would be fine to kind of kick things back to the committee and have a little conversation about it, maybe over email, if we were not yet convened or won't convene soon. And that might offer opportunities for us to strategize. Maybe there's a particular thing that we want to say to particular groups. That's one thing. Figure out who's to say it, and other things like that. So that seems like that kind of intermediate level of some process, but not overburdening amounts of process, seems like the best option to me.
And if I might just qualify my position, I'm in the same exact boat as you guys too. I didn't state it as well, but
And I didn't get a chance to go to Doreen's event at Dickinson College. I was, very much in support of that. Only thing I wish that we would have known about it a little bit sooner, because I really, it would have been good for me to be there. Being, of course, a senior leader at Dickinson, I probably should have been in the room to support her and clap her along. But when I found out about it, it was just too late for me to do anything with my schedule. So, but as far as hopefully it went well. I don't know. Did anyone go to it?
I'm sorry?
Did anyone get a chance to go and hear how she did? No.
Well, we can use the Rotary invitation as a kind of case study, because it's far into the future. So they have a lot of speakers lined up, and I don't think we're going to have a slot until next month. So we can use that as our kind of first test case. And again, to be very clear, the person came to our table, found out I was the co-chair, inquired about our participation. So I think we absolutely have a chance to say, hey, it's not just going to be the co-chair. Other people will be joining, and this can be the content. So we have an opportunity now to work on that.
I'll just say that I thought the model when you, I, and Tawana went to the League of Women Voters event was, I thought, a really good model. That there were the co-chairs there, but then there was another kind of random member who had things to share and contribute. And I think that kind of model embodies what Tawanda had in mind when she first suggested that we should have different models of leadership. That we have we have a lot of different people who are recognized as leaders. Yes, you guys are going to take sometimes the lion's share of the kind of spokesperson role, but like lots of us have things to contribute, and yeah, I thought that, as I said, I thought that was a really good model, and if we continued that, I think that'd be a great thing.
Yeah, I think as we continue too, we'll figure out, like, I hate to call it this, but low stakes, high stakes presentations too. So, speaking to a class of 12 students, maybe a little bit lower stakes than I'm publishing an article in the local newspaper or the Patriot or something, where let's talk about this, and even maybe another commission going to them that's a little bit more higher stakes. So I think we'll feel that out too. And once we know what kind of ask will be upon us too, because we don't really know. We've gotten a couple here and there, but as we continue, maybe especially into next year, as we're really in the thick of it, we might have to regroup and say, okay, we're now getting a lot of media coverage, or it's other commissions and other townships want to know what we're doing. So I think then when we're getting a little bit into the meat of it, we'll have to say, okay, how are we doing this now if we're getting more popular? But I think right now we're kind of all in agreement, it sounds like.
Tawanda?
Yeah, just to revisit the email address piece. I actually had experience with that. So someone in the community reached out to me personally to say, some thoughts that they had about a particular subject matter, and would the TRC be interested in being represented or contributing or having input? And but because they reached out to me personally, I referred them to the TRC email address so that it comes through in a more informative and transparent way, right? So because of my own work with Lincoln Cemetery and with other things that I do in the community, people can tend to just reach out to me, and that's not, I don't think, helpful, because we have a means, and so that's probably my support of using the email address as much as possible. I mean, we have monthly meetings. We have an email address. We can, there's things kind of already set up for people to be able to reach out to us, and I think using those methods can be helpful.
Title.
What is our email address?
trc@carlislepa.org.
Thank you.
Welcome.
One question with that. So I have also been in the same boat as Tawanda, getting some emails to my work email, not my personal one. Is it good practice for us? Because again, I'm very much of, once things get difficult for people, we lose them. Do you think it is enough? So if I were to get an email, to reply to that person and CC the TRC email on that and say, thank you for letting me know this. I actually, I'm responding to this with our TRC email on this, so it will go to that box too. Just because I don't want to respond to people and say, can you email this to another one? But at least if I put it on an email back to somebody, it will be captured in that email also. Do you think that's fine practice? I'm not sure.
Yeah, sorry. So part of what I'm not saying is, of course, the Sunshine Law implications. So there are some developments that are kind of in the works um, that will help this along. And Counselor Stubbe, I don't know if you are in a position to speak to that at this point, but I think incorporating that email address as much as possible makes what we're doing public record, right? So that we've, so for instance, what Doreen did really didn't, too much involve the rest of the commission. And I think part of the conversation is maybe it needed to, or maybe it didn't need to. But if we're looking at what the commission does as far as our action plan and how we're moving, it doesn't fit into the entire scope.
If I could, one thing that we need to be mindful of is when you're using your personal or other email addresses, you run the risk that if someone does an open records request or worse yet, a subpoena or something, that you're now subjecting your other email addresses to becoming discoverable. You probably don't want that. I could think of a lot of reasons why you wouldn't want that. So, um, as cumbersome as it may sound, I think what Tawanda is saying is very sound because of the fact that the more you're copying even though it seems easier and it's more user friendly, I get what you're saying, Tristan. But we're also in the world of being a public entity, and so I think you can do it, but just know what you're potentially doing. Be fully informed of
I
what
think
you're
my
doing.
work email is probably public like that if somebody wanted to find it. I just wasn't sure, because we had said that had come up after. So is it probably better practice then to say instead, can you, copy this email and just send it to TRC? Is that probably the way to err, or is the copying okay? 'Cause some of them are like low stakes where it's like, hey, I have an idea. It's not. Obviously, if it's a higher stakes email to go through, I'm not a government person, so I don't know what stakes are up for that.
Just to chime in if that's okay. So to Tawanda's point, and I think similar to what Kendall had brought up, I mean the advantage of utilizing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission email is that that's housed through the at carlislepa.org email, like all those email addresses. So then it's essentially like a public email account. At this point, I don't know that Tawanda and Emily, if you do or do not have access to it. I know the last I recall, Owen was working on like getting you access to it, so it's still kind of like up in the works and making it happen. I know that Sean and I have access to it at least to be able to like view it, and then if there were any emails to send them. I mean, I can say that at this point there haven't been any. There's just been like test emails sent to it. But to what Tawanda and kind of were saying, the advantage is that it's then a public record. And I guess from my personal experience, I can share that in serving on council, I often get emails to my personal email account about council related items. And when that happens, I try to then respond to them using my public Carlisle at carlislepa.org email account, just so that it's all housed in that public space. It's all housed in that area. So I don't know if that is helping or not, but just kind of reiterating, I think, what Tawanda and Kenda were saying.
Excellent, thanks. I think we have some guidance here then. It sounds like for informal off-the-cuff queries, we trust one another to respond to those. For more in-depth things like presentations, try to direct people as much as possible to the TRC at carlislepa.org email address, or direct them to one of the co-chairs, and then the co-chairs will be expected to run it through the committee so that we can collaborate on content and presenters. But I think we should also extend to one another a bit of grace. We are individuals coming to this, and we have the different relationships that we have. And there may be some people who are not comfortable writing an email about something that's happening, especially given the nature of the kinds of things that we're engaged in. And so there will be times probably that members of this commission as individuals have concerns that are brought to them as an individual, and they may have to use some discretion about how they decide to share that with the group. But I feel satisfied that we have an understanding of how we're going to handle invitations for speaking events and things like that. Does anybody else have anything to say about that before we move on to the next thing? Okay, now we're on to the exciting work of operationalizing the action plan. And Tawanda and I were kind of chatting about the different components of operationalizing this thing. And I don't really have it in mind that we're going to go through linearly through A, B, and C. Maybe we can talk about all of those things as they interconnect. So a thought we had is that we may want to form working groups to address the things topically. We may want to, at this meeting, discuss a cadence of meeting and reporting. And what I mean by that is how often should this whole body meet? And if we have working groups, how often should they be meeting? And what's the expectation for them to report to the larger group? And then there's also this question of a preliminary budget. And I'm going to ask Tawanda to chime in and remind us of the date for submitting a request to be considered in the preliminary budget, because I feel like you had that was on your mind. Do you mind reminding us?
I do believe this body would want to come up with something preliminarily by the end of August. So by the end of this month, we would want to at least have a figure in mind to be able to present to Susan and to Borough Council, that could be a part of their September budget deliberations. So my idea, and Emily, you can tell me if I'm talking too much, my idea is that this would be something that we would entrust to a group of no more than 2, maybe 3 people to kind of put some meat to that.
My concern about assigning it to a working group rather than having a whole group is how are we going to figure out what the stuff that we need is and what it costs? So it might work well for us to have a preliminary conversation about that here and then send it off to a smaller working group. And maybe that's exactly what you had in mind also.
Yeah, I'm just, so we're looking at our monthly meetings are the second Monday of the month. As long as we can come back together at our September meeting, vote on something that we would like to request from council at so that they could have that as part of their September meeting. Just as long as we're falling before, I guess, the second Thursday. Am I?
Yeah, I think if I understand correctly, you're saying that, timing is really critical right now to figure out what it is we need before that next council meeting. So if we don't come to some terms tonight, then we may need a working group or something to help us figure out. So when we come back together at our next meeting, it's a little more organized and have something to react to. That's what I'm hearing you say. Is that correct, Wanda?
Yeah, and I don't think we necessarily need to have an itemized budget line by line at this point of the conversation. But are we talking about $100,000? Are we talking about $400,000? Are we talking about $40,000? Like where are we in the ballpark? What are the things that we think we'll need to spend money on? So for instance, part of the work that we'll do is data analysis. So having somebody that can pull data, that can analyze data and compare it and do all of that sort of researchy type of stuff. That's part of it. Maybe we also need some sort of budget for holding some of the events and community conversations that we want to have. Like, what are some of the financial needs that we'll have so that we can make this work impactful, right? So that it's not just something that's a total volunteer effort.
Yeah, I feel like we can have, maybe I'm just optimistic, but I feel like we can have a conversation tonight that can outline a good bit of that. And then I agree that we could probably then assign it to a couple of people to just actually write up numbers. So, like, for instance, one of the things that's on the action plan is that we intend to invite speakers. So maybe what we do is figure out how many speakers tonight, and then like just we have a number, we decide a number tonight, and we then know that, and like we'll be budgeting for 3 speakers or something like that. Um, we say that we're going to host some participate in certain community events. How much? What are we going to do for that? Are we going to make sure that those are only free things for us to do? Like, I think if we can make decisions of that kind, like kind of going down the action plan and thinking about how many of such things, what kind in general, and then somebody else can we can assign them to some working group to actually the tabulating of, well, if we have 5 events, that kind of thing. I feel like that can be done tonight.
And a couple of things. I'm looking at the things that we have on here for the third quarter action items, for instance. And one is initiating a community survey. I'm not sure if we intend to use some sort of a free survey monkey type of thing, or are we going to use something more robust? So that will be something that may very well create a budget item. And the one about inviting speaker to a meeting with relevant experience. And I think you brought up, Emily, that you knew of someone, but it may cost to get them here. And that was at one of the really early meetings. I don't know if you remember that
Yeah,
conversation. Okay, so I mean,
yeah,
I don't know whether you have any ballpark of what that person might charge. Is it just travel and hotel? Is it also some sort of honorarium? What we'd be looking at there.
right. And what do we know about what the borough is permitted to pay for? I don't know if there are rules against paying honoraria for speakers, or if there's a policy of inviting only speakers who will um, speak for free. So I think another question we might have as we assign this to a smaller working group is there are the things that we want, and then there are the things that the borough can/is willing to pay for, and we want that to be pretty close, I would say. So it sounds like something to look into is speakers' fees and honoraria, and cost of travel. Uh, let's make a decision. Let's have a discussion about the survey. Where are people on this question of whether to use one of these widely available tools or to commission a professional social scientist to conduct a survey for a cost?
I it, I have a thought, but also back to the previous thought about what the borough is allowed to pay for. We also have to give consideration for things that would have to go out for bid,
Yeah.
and that sort of process too, which will be part of, I think, that working group's responsibility too, is to make sure that we're fitting things the way that they need to fit. And then also about the community survey piece, I think it would be a good idea if we could get that all sort of in one bundle with the person that would do any sort of data analysis so that they are creating the survey. Um, and we are able to say, this is what we're looking for. This is the information that we're trying to capture. And because they do that sort of work, they'll know what questions to ask rather than us trying to figure that out and using SurveyMonkey. I think that that could be all kind of looped in with the data person.
I was actually surprised that we were thinking of this much stuff for a budget because I thought most of this was going to be on free, as much as possible. I was thinking like maybe a couple $100s for like food for events. So I'm kind of taking this in that we were expecting to hire out and everything, because I was about to say SurveyMonkey, you can have up to 10 questions for free, and then you have to charge because I am used to doing stuff on free. So I think if that's something that we wanted to do is hire out, I think we can do that ourselves. Obviously, like, we are not, I don't think any of us like social scientists to be able to do this, but I've put out surveys to every municipality in Cumberland County and I analyze the results myself. So obviously, like, I'm not definitely going to do the work of what somebody else would do, but I think we also have to be mindful that we might not get $10,000 to hire out. And I don't know what kind of budget we're working, if they're like, here's $100 for the next year, or if it's we will expend money here. I don't know what we're even looking at, so I don't know. I'm just, again, if it's free, it's for me, is my saying at work. So to hear like these numbers being thrown
Yeah.
around, I was shocked by that. But if we can get the money, I think that is great.
Well,
So
can I jump in real quick? We
Sure.
do have, the borough does have now, does we could still have someone work on it, but we do have survey software on our citizen engagement platform that can make pretty robust surveys. So just throwing that out there, that we may already have some of this technology that you want. So
Thank you, Stephanie. Brett, for you.
Yeah, I had a couple of questions. So I was trying to understand what kind of surveys we were imagining, and that might actually help dictate what kind of, like whether we need somebody who's a specialist in Strata or R to do it. So if we're going to ask, say, open-ended questions about people's experience with it or whatnot, having a quantitative social science isn't actually going to be very helpful because it's not going to be very easy to code, things like that. Whereas if we're imagining asking people things like, I don't know, uh, things that are more quantitative that you can code more easily, such that then we can look for getting kind of, looking for statistically significant results, etc., then I can see that. But I just don't know what we're imagining surveying people about such that we would actually need really robust statistical tools. So I just don't know that that's the case. That's the first thought I had about that. I'll maybe leave it there.
Kendall.
So I guess my thought is that I'm looking at it to be all, like, so that it all sort of marries, right? So that the quantitative in some way speaks to the qualitative data, and the qualitative data speaks to the quantitative data, that they kind of dovetail one another. Um, and I do think that we will be able. I think there's a high likelihood that we could be successful in securing some funds to put money behind this data piece. If we keep our end goal in mind, we're asking, if there's necessary changes that we're asking the borough to make with regard to policy, or if we're looking at any sort of reparations, those things are going to have to be heavily backed by data in order for them to go forth, and not, no diss on SurveyMonkey because that's how I got my BS, but like, not necessarily data that we can glean and analyze ourselves, but something that someone who's a researcher, a published researcher, is able to provide us with some sort of report, so that that report can then be used to make decisions going further.
Brad?
Yeah, just as a quick kind of response. So, if you wanted to find out information, say, about poverty levels, we don't need to hire a social scientist to find out, to like survey people and find out their income. That information has already been collected. And so you don't have to be like a trained social scientist to be able to find like the US Census data
Sure.
about that. So like I could gather such information, and the research that I already do gathers information of this kind. So like I think that's like really simple stuff. I was thinking if we're actually doing new research, if it's quantitative and character, then indeed we might need to hire a social scientist. But I just don't know what that kind of information would be that we'd be looking for.
So I'm looking at, since you mentioned poverty, right? So I'm thinking, how does poverty inform rates of arrest, right? Or how does poverty inform rates of home ownership? Like, how do those things in how is poverty an indicator for poor social outcomes? How is poverty an indicator for social determinants of health? So those are the things that I'm thinking of. Like, how can we use the ACS data and put it with other data to tell us things that we didn't necessarily realize?
Brad?
May we also consider just how many respondents we actually anticipate? Just given that notoriously there's low participation regardless of what kind of survey. I guess I'm kind of wondering, do we put out something free, start there, and see what we're able to get before we even jump to that next level?
From what you're saying, Tawanda, can you? I know you were saying we need somebody to make these questions for us. What kind of questions are you anticipating there? Just because I'm genuinely not sure, like, what we would ask that would, like, what kind of questions would we ask that would give us that kind of data, that you're saying, like, those connections there. I'm lost here.
No problem, and I'm sorry. So I wasn't. I was probably talking about two things at the same time. So as far as Raf's point with quantitative data and using ACS and poverty indicators, yes, we can do that. We don't need a social scientist to pull ACS data. We can see that for ourselves. We might need a social scientist, though, to take that and be able to perform some sort of criminal justice analysis so that we can put that poverty rate, in conversation with rates of arrest, or in conversation with rates of incarceration, or in conversation with social determinants of health. So there's that. The questions on the survey would be, I'm guessing, more qualitative in nature. So I don't think those questions on the survey give us that data that I was speaking to, but the questions on the survey, we would want those to be able to flesh out some of the data that we're looking for, so that we're asking the right questions. And I think, in my opinion, a social scientist is going to be able to better ask the questions that we want asked, so that we can get the information that we want to get. Is it muddier?
I'm not a survey person, so there's one thing that comes up with me because I can't figure out, like, the kind of surveys. I struggle with surveys myself, figuring out questions. But I'm also wondering, if we're doing a survey like that, what would then be the point of doing any of that story collection that we were talking about? Because it seems like we're trying to do that, but with a survey, when we can probably talk to people and extrapolate the same kind of things in a more organic manner. And again, I think you're talking more scientifically. But I feel like we would just be asking the questions on a survey that somebody might not answer or answer like we anticipate. That's why I just asked for like an example because I can't envision.
Well, my thought is that the storytelling piece, the truth telling piece, like that's one piece of data. The survey is another piece of data. Maybe there's overlap and maybe there isn't. I don't think we're necessarily going to get everyone to tell us stories or everyone to do the truth telling and everyone is going to complete the survey. So I think both of these things work together.
Just a thought. I guess I'm going back to number of respondents. Would it mean more if the questions came from us, even if it wasn't, even if they weren't perfect for the kind of data mining we're looking for? I guess I have a cynical view of how many people we would get to respond, and I wonder if the survey, if we just don't take it too far, but more just make it more of our own. I don't know if that makes sense.
And my thinking on it is, it may boil down to credibility at the end of once the report is done. Will the council see what we've done as credible? Will the community see it as credible if we do it versus if it's partially or fully produced by some expert? I don't know that any of us would say we're experts in surveying it and data analysis. I did a dissertation. I'm not an expert. I did it one time, so far from an expert on it. But I think it would be beneficial if we had some sort of sidebar conversation with borough staff and tried to find out, what does a realistic budget look like? What is their expectation for if we want to do a survey and all? Are they going to be okay with it being done at a more meaningful but amateurish level? Or do they want something that is more perhaps done by an expert and robust, but that's going to cost? And, and it may be fairly expensive depending on who we go with. So I think it would make sense to ask some questions before we go too far down the rabbit hole, and then we put together some robust proposal and they just cross it all out and say Survey Monkey it is, or they're set up already tool.
One thing to note potentially too is since we go to December 2022, this could also be something that we look at for next budget cycle. Maybe once we have some credibility in the community and people see what we're doing and have their eyes on us, that might make people more interested in helping us out. So that might not be something that will be done by December 2022, but it can always be added into what our report is an appendix. So we can think like for next year too. I just don't know if we can put this all together by August too, so that's something like just because we're not doing it now doesn't mean we can't ever do it. So maybe we find a lot of really good work, and then next year we'll also have then that credibility behind us as a commission to then do a survey. It would kind of be backwards in a way, but maybe people would be more receptive to us after a year's time once they see what we're doing, and if we make some good strides by then, we'll have some better reception. And I know that's like a monkey wrench in the whole conversation, but I just don't want to make it seem like if we don't get it this year, that's the end of it. We can always do it next budget cycle also.
Well, just to add something on to what Tristan just said, we may want to keep in mind that because of the American Rescue Plan, that there is more flexibility in this budget cycle than there could be next budget cycle. So I'll just throw that out there too.
When is next budget cycle? Because I'm wondering if that's too late based on their current expectations of when we will have a report prepared and ready for them.
It would be a year from now.
Which to me seems like that's too late. Unless we come back and say we need more time, but we don't yet know whether we'll need more time. And so we're almost conceding early that we're not going to get it done.
One question, though, and maybe a point in favor of Tristan's suggestion, is we might better figure out what particular role the survey will fulfill in terms of information by that time. Because as I was suggesting, it may well be that the kind of information, some of the information that we're talking about, can be collected with data that is already out there. So some will be collected that way, and it'll just be, yeah. So some of them will be collected that way. Some of the information we're already talking about is the kind of storytelling and analyzing historical data. And so it may be that maybe after a bit more time, we'll figure out what particular role will surveying community members actually play. Because at present, I must say, I'm still a little bit curious about what this information is going to look like, what information we'll get that will actually be more, that will actually be helpful in addition to the information that's already available to be collected.
I must admit that I'm a bit skeptical about our need for a paid social scientist data analyst at this point. In part because there are some questions where the data doesn't matter. There are some policies that, not in Carlisle Borough per se, but there could be policies that exist that are racist or sexist that don't actually negatively impact anyone because there's not an opportunity for them to be applied to anyone. And so I don't think we need to wait on a data point to say this many people were disadvantaged by this policy. If the policy is bad, it doesn't matter if there weren't in fact any people who were disadvantaged by it. So there are some things that we might examine and decide, in theory, this policy is harmful. In theory, this policy has the potential to be discriminatory in the following ways. Maybe it hasn't actually done that because it hasn't actually been applied in a case, but nevertheless, we may want to propose changing it. So I think we are in a situation where we have a lot of data to work with already. We do have some pretty good tools for collecting qualitative feedback, which I think I agree with Raph is more important to me at this point. And I also think that there are some questions out there where we can examine the policy and ask ourselves, do we think that this policy has the potential to discriminate and divide, even if it hasn't in fact done that? And we can make a proposal that that policy be changed so that it never does do that. So at this point, I feel a bit skeptical about our needs. I guess we did say in the action plan that we approved that we will be inviting speakers. So we probably do need to come up with a rough estimate of honoraria and travel costs. And I think that can go in a preliminary budget. But I do think we need to be very reasonable in what we ask. Because I gather that, like any municipality, the budgeting process is probably pretty tight here. In fact, I just read in my Carlisle Gazette that it's like 1.7 cents per tax dollar goes to the borough. So they're not dealing with a ton of money here, so we do want to be mindful of that. So that's my 2 cents. I don't think we need to pay for a social scientist at this point. I do think we need to work up a budget for speakers' fees and the cost of travel.
I agree with that.
I also think that, like, if someone already has, like, one of the major statistical, if the borough already has use of one of the major statistical instruments, like R or like Strat, I don't know which one they have, but if that's already had, the cost of actually getting someone who's more familiar with using those than us is actually pretty cheap. Because any undergraduate who has or almost has their degree in any of the social sciences will have been trained to do that. So I just wonder if that could be really cheap, because we're just trusting them to run the survey instrument that already exists. So it may be really cheap to do things like that. So maybe a small miscellaneous thing in case we need to use that. We budget some really small amount to have somebody work for a few hours.
Okay. let me do a call for volunteers. Are there 2 or 3 people who are particularly interested in working on drafting a preliminary budget?
I could jump in on that. I would just probably want to be coupled with somebody who knows like speaker fees. I could think of some of the other stuff and like a general idea, but speaker fees if somebody is a little bit more has a grasp on that.
If we're talking about
I,
academics, I have some knowledge about that. Maybe we should talk about who we want. That might actually help us.
Yeah, because different people have different price tags for sure. Tawanda, sorry.
I'm not 100% comfortable with putting the kibosh on a social scientist or someone to do the research, because the first quarter of 2022 is to analyze historical data from the borough, historical society, local academic institutions, and similar entities for additional data to assess. And I feel like for far too long, this sort of work has gotten there's no room in the budget answer. There's not staff, there's not resources to be able to devote to this. And I'm really hesitant in moving forward without even exploring how we might be able to get some resources to put towards credible, researched, published data that really informs the work. I think that's what a lot of people are looking for from this work too. So I think I'm just really hesitant to move forward with a super conservative means of resourcing this work.
We can always, so maybe we could do this. Here's a proposal. Tristan, Raph, and Tawanda are the subcommittee that's going to come up with a preliminary budget. We can always come up with a figure for a social scientist, and we can set the budget up such that, of course, we're going to have to request anytime we want to use it. And we could delay the conversation about whether we all feel that that's necessary. So we could put in a budget request that includes a social scientist. And then as we get more clarity about what information we lack that we do not yet have or cannot theoretically get ourselves, we can revisit the question of whether the members of this body support using the funds in that way. Now, obviously, Councilmember Stubbe is on the call, so it will be a less powerful ask in that way. But it's still included and speaks to your hesitation.
I appreciate that, Emily, and I think it comes from this place of, again, one, for far too long this work has been under resourced, so there's that. And then I think I'm always coming from a place of it's better to need and not, or wait, it's better to have and not need than to need and not have. So if we ask for it and we have it and we can use it, then great. If we have it and we don't need it, then it goes, you get where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
And we don't want to discredit the volunteer work that we'll be having too. Just like we don't need a social scientist to go through the historical records when the historical society is on this, to go through Dickinson's archives when Dickinson has an archival team that are willing to talk about what they found. There are professors at Dickinson that want to talk to us about African American history. Just to say, you know, that we need a social scientist to do that is kind of discrediting the people in the community that want to come together and help this and support this. So that's the something to think
But
of.
Tristan, I've been a volunteer in this community, and I have been frustrated because this work has not been resourced. So I hear you, but we can't. I mean, the burden of the work can't constantly lay at the feet of volunteers who are doing the work because there's no other way that it's going to get done. If we find a different way that it can be resourced, I think it's worth it to the volunteers and to the community to explore that.
Well, I'm mostly just saying that just because it doesn't happen with social scientists doesn't mean it's not going to happen. So we have people that we can rely on, that if we can't get $20,000 for a social scientist, there are people in the community that are more than willing to talk about this work. So it's not that if we don't pay, we won't have it. It's that we have other organizations to rely on with this. So I don't want to say it's social scientists or bust with it. We can find the resources other places, so we shouldn't say, just discredit it completely.
I see no harm with asking. I mean, if we ask and we receive, great. If we ask and we don't receive, then we know that we need to go the volunteer route and do things more ourselves. But we don't know really we can speculate, but we don't really know what the borough's budget is and what they can and cannot do. I think um, I see no harm in us putting it on the table and saying this is what we think we need. If we don't use it, I mean, everyone likes to get money back, so they'll be more than happy to take it back if we don't use it. But or they may very well say, well, we can't afford it, but that's their call. I don't know that we need to hamper ourselves and not put it on the table. So I would support getting the proposal out there. I mean, the three of you working on it, get the proposal out there. If they say no, they say no. We move forward.
Yeah, I think though, like I agree with that sentiment if we judge that we need it, and that's the thing that I'm still a little bit stuck on because for like, I guess maybe what's going on is that maybe we're talking about slightly different things that need to be found out because like as someone who researches police, there is a lot of information already about police. So if you want to find out information about police versus poverty, there are things published literally every single week. Like every single week. Like the Journal of Science is published every week. Nature is published every week. So if we actually want to just find the information, like national trends, like how does X affect Y, though there is lots of information, and that work has not been neglected for probably like 60 or 70 years. If we wanted to
Right.
find information that's specific to Carlisle, like how often does a poor person in Carlisle get arrested, or how often does a person in Carlisle XYZ? The worry that I have with doing that kind of thing is that when you get really small sample sizes, then you get bigger possible distortions. And so if it turns out that some person who was arrested 5 times is like, screw this place, let me move somewhere else, they move out of the community, then it turns out it looks like it doesn't, being arrested a lot of times doesn't have a great effect. So I just worry that like, I just don't know if we actually need to do the drill down to the specifics of this community via a survey instrument of the people who are here and willing to respond, if that's more informative than national data that's been around for a long time.
But I think, Raf, you're making that point, is that yes, the data needs to be drilled down to Carlisle because we're asking Carlisle to make the changes. We're saying, Carlisle, this is the truth about Carlisle, right? So it has to be relevant to the borough of Carlisle, and the distortions that you speak. And I don't doubt that the work has been under resourced nationally. I don't, or that it's been resourced nationally. I don't doubt that. But I'm speaking specifically to the borough of Carlisle, right? So keep in mind, and let's keep in front of us, that there's a reason why this commission exists. And part of that is to uncover truths that have been covered. And maybe we need a social scientist to uncover them, and maybe we don't. I think it's worth us saying, okay, we'd like to be able to have a social scientist look at this. What could those distortions mean? What could this mean, and how does it relate to the truth that we are attempting to uncover for this community? And I think for this community, this work has been under resourced for a very long time. I think we have anecdotal information of things that have gone on in the borough, but a lot of people were really surprised by the data that Deputy Mayor Schultz put out at the town hall. It wasn't a huge surprise to me, but it was to some people, because that work isn't necessarily being done in the ways in which keep the community moving forward in more equitable and transformative ways. So that's again where I'm coming from. I feel like I've said this way too much already, but Yeah.
I think we're all in agreement that these issues are terribly important and ought to be invested in, and ought to be invested in more than they have been historically. But I think there's also a lot of agreement that doing that may not serve our purposes. So when we get incredibly local data and it's distorting, it doesn't actually serve as justification for what we're asking for. So if what we're asking for is, for example, for the police department to hire a couple of violence disruptors, if the data says, well, that's not really a problem in our community, then that's actually working against that request, when that request might be legitimate anyway, for the reasons of the data being distorted when it's so localized. So I don't think it's a matter of a disagreement about whether it's worth investing in these problems. I think we all agree about that. The disagreement about whether to move forward with this is about whether that information will actually help us do what we all are committed to doing. However, I also think there's agreement that there's no harm in asking. And if we do decide that we need a social scientist to collect something for us, we can delineate those questions later and assign that social scientist those questions, budget permitting. So, do we have agreement to form a working group of Tristan, Rath, and Tawanda to develop a preliminary budget that will include the cost of hiring a social scientist, and that we'll entertain that question later? Okay. So that's item C, preliminary budget. I think we've covered that well. Yes, please.
So I just want to get some clarity about how many speakers we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
That might be helpful for the working group to address the question of budget.
Yeah, what do y'all think? I'm still a bit confused about the speakers. So I was surprised by how our community events conversation went, because I think we're doing that, but then it seemed like we're not doing that. So the speakers are meant for public events, is that right? Not just public in the sense that our meetings are obviously public meetings, but we're going to do some publicity and try to get people to attend the events with speakers, correct?
Yeah, I actually wanted to return to that too. When we had that, I think we agreed that we were not having community events, and I thought, well, the action plan says we're going to participate in some, and the action plan also says that we're going to have speakers, and so I thought we were doing that, at least to an extent. I thought the only question we were kind of discussing before is kind of what do we do when we have these random requests? Are we going to entertain those or not? And I thought the answer was yes, we would entertain some.
Okay.
As far, oh.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, as far as I'm also taking a look at the time, and we had wanted to keep our meetings to 90 minutes. So, as far as the question about the number of speakers, Raf, if we could just maybe even if you could send out a when to meet for, or good to meet, whatever that thing's called, for me, you and Tristan to maybe get together for like 3 or 4 hours over the next week, retreat kind of style.
And I would trust the three of you to come up with a schedule. You know, I would trust this subgroup. I don't know how you feel, Kendall and Raz. I would trust the subgroup to come up with a schedule and a proposal for number of speakers.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I echo that.
So it sounds like we have our first working group, which is the budget group. We're running out of time tonight to decide other working groups, but we can also kind of mush working groups in with cadence of meeting and reporting. Do we think that we're okay to move to our next meeting being the September meeting, the second Monday of September? Or do you think that we need to have a second meeting this month in order to further operationalize the action plan and delineate more working groups. Raz.
Just given where we're leaving off here, I would advocate for a second meeting this month.
Other thoughts?
I would advocate for a working group to come up with a proposal for what those working groups should be.
Brad, is that a reach? No. I like that proposal, Kendall. Yeah, so we have a budget working group and a working group. And that working group could meet later this month and then come to the September meeting with a proposal for further working groups. And we could, if it makes sense, the three of us could be that working group. And I'll get in touch with Doreen and see which working group she would like to be added to, and we can develop other working groups that way. Okay, so we have a working group, and a budget working group.
I like that.
And both will report out at our next meeting. Raph, go ahead.
I just have a question. If the other four of you are in the working group, is that too many people not to be required to have a public meeting?
Oh, good question.
Yeah, that's a quorum.
That's right.
But we also said that if it's just doing, we're not making formalized decisions. We're just trying to figure out our organization and ground level work. Then it's not. It's an informal and such that it wouldn't meet the definition of a public meeting.
I would probably be more comfortable if we let the three of you do the working group, and let the three of us do the budget. And then Doreen can kind of backfill as needed. And that way, since she's not here to make that commitment, number one, she's not here to make that commitment. And number two, it keeps the working group at the size that we need it to be. That's just my suggestion.
I like that. Okay, so we're decided. Are we ready to move on to public comment? Any other thoughts for the good of the order?
Sorry to forever be contrarian, but just one more quick question about the order of things. So the budget is needed for that September meeting. Like we it must be approved there, and the schedule of working groups also must be decided at that next meeting.
I don't think the latter is a must be decided.
Okay.
So if I could, Raph, just say that I don't think you necessarily apologize for being contrarian. You're a law school professor. It's cool. So, but I think with September, we kind of run into the issue that I thought we were going to have. So our next meeting would be the second Monday, which is the 13th. That's going to be after Borough Council meets. So when we meet on the 13th, we're going to want to be as solidified as we can with what we would want budgetarily.
I think that this is an argument for having a second meeting this month. That's what I initially thought, that maybe we want to be sure that we have our budget situation straightened out properly. Yeah, that's what I thought from the beginning.
I appreciate your being contrary then.
Okay, so I'm hearing a both and. We're going to have a working group, a budget working group. The budget working group is going to be coordinating to meet, and the working group, we can begin to collaborate online using Google Docs or something like that, and then we'll decide if we need to do anything beyond that. And we will add another August meeting. And now I guess we're getting down into the latter part of the agenda. Let's see here. The 23rd?
I have 3 weeks out, being the 23rd.
That's the 23rd?
I would recommend the 30th.
The 30th.
Only because to give an ample time to have these discussions. I think it's going to be really hard to have these sidebar discussions and be prepared by the 23rd. We could do it, but having an extra week, I think, would be helpful.
Agreed.
Yep, great suggestion. Okay, so August 30th, we'll have another meeting, and then we'll go back to our regular second Monday. And by our August 30th meeting, hopefully we'll have a proposed meeting schedule for the other working groups so they can coordinate with our meeting of the whole. So they're kind of meeting during off weeks or collaborating on documents. Okay, anything else before we move on to public comment?
I was waiting on Raph.
All right, Stephanie, do we have anyone over there on the Zoom?
As of now, no one has their hand raised.
Okay.
Oh, wait. Oh, they put it down. Oh, yeah, we do. Yeah, hold on. Let me, put on here. Okay, Fred, you can unmute yourself and speak.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay.
If he's talking.
Can you hear me?
We can barely hear you.
Oh, but you can hear me somewhat.
Oh,
Now we can hear you.
Okay, this is Fred Baldwin. I've followed your meeting. I'd like, to be brief, I'd like to suggest two things. That first, I'm with those members of the commission who are skeptical about the value of a social scientist at this point. I've had very substantial experience in Office of Research and Evaluation in a couple of federal agencies, and as a private contractor worked with a lot of consulting firms. The short point is that you can contract out particular chores, but you can't contract out your thinking. The very hard part is not the research, but knowing exactly what questions you want to answer. And several of you made that point, and I think that point was well taken. Anything else, the notion that a consultant or sociologist, social scientist can somehow help you, absent knowing exactly what you want to know, is frankly kind of magical thinking. I also, perhaps less strongly, disagree with the notion that there's no harm in asking. There is harm in asking in terms of public perception. If you ask for funds for sociologists, surveys, what have you, and haven't thoroughly exhausted your existing resources, it's going to discredit you and risk jeopardizing your mission. So I would urge the working group that's looking at this to reconsider the whole notion of contracting out until you know exactly what you want to ask for. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Anyone else, Stephanie?
No, does not look like it.
Thank you. Okay, with that, I think we are ready to move on to item 5, announcements and future meeting schedule. We pretty much reviewed that. So we've got a meeting of the whole on August 30th, and then we'll go back to our schedule of the second Monday of every month. In the meantime, the two working groups we formed will coordinate their own meetings. Those working groups are composed of a small enough number that you don't have to have an open meeting with an agenda. Any questions about item A, scheduling for future meetings? Does anyone need clarification about anything? Okay. How about item B, announcements and items for future agendas?
Just real quick, Emily, Stephanie, do we need to communicate that additional meeting, since the second Monday is already on the website? Do we need to communicate?
Yes, make sure Joyce gets that information, because she has to advertise that in the newspaper. Okay. I was going to tell you that after the meeting, but since she has to.
Thanks.
Let me check though. I will need to check on that date because the first Monday is Labor Day. So Harb may be meeting on the 30th. That's the only. I don't know if you could move it to if that's the case, maybe it could be a Tuesday, or I don't know. I'll have to work on that. I'll look at that tomorrow.
And it could be held in a different location. It just has to be publicly noticed. Is that correct?
That's true. That is correct because the Parks and Rec board meets at the Parks and Rec building. So as long as it just wouldn't be able to incorporate the Zoom part of it.
Okay.
People would have to attend in person if they wanted to, because we
Okay.
can only do these kind of meetings right here in town hall.
I see. Thank you. Okay. Other announcements or items? Great. Hearing none, we're ready to move on to item 7, adjournment. It is 7:35, and I declare this meeting officially adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.